The Fitzgerald Report disclosures of paltry contributions by major overseas mineral companies to Australian tax revenues, utilising the excessively generous tax concessions our predecessors allowed, were greeted with stunned silence by the opposition during the recent May election campaign.
But come hell or high water, this minister was not going to allow his bill to be interfered with. All sections of the people, all parties, except the opposition in this parliament, and still the deputy leader of the Country Party appears here as a representative of the international corporations.
And I confess to a considerable degree of surprise that the minister should place such weight on what I believe to be the now discredited Fitzgerald Report.
Discredited by who?
That report
Discredited by who?
is neither a full or accurate assessment of the contribution made by the mining industry to Australia's economic welfare.
The Fitzgerald Report is the most significant report that's been presented to this parliament in 3 years. And this government will say, and I hope the Petroleum Minerals Authority will say, and I hope that future governments will say, thus far and no further. You've made enough. We won't let you rape and plunder our country. We want what is rightfully available to the people of this nation, to future generations of Australians.
Hello, I'm Craig Emerson, and I wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Good to see Paul Keating in good form. This was the bill that bit the dust. It was the one that the High Court ruled out on some sort of technicalities. We've got learned contributors here, participants, and they can tell us if they like the basis of ruling it out, but that was its fate. I'm very happy to introduce and then convene this session on the Petroleum and Minerals Authority, a bill to establish that. I do want to point out that I'm a little bit nervous because this is the first time I've been allowed in this room. Despite working in the old Parliament House for 2 years with Peter Walsh, and the old one and the new one for 5 years with Bob Hawke. In fact, I'm not even sure which side the government of the day was on. This one? Okay, closer to the door. A couple of tall tales and true of the legendary past before we get on to our session. One of my responsibilities was to prepare Dorothy Dix's for Bob, and he'd say, give us a few facts, mate, give us a few facts, and I'd give him a few facts and he'd come in. Peter Barron would therefore sit here in this side, and they would walk out and Barron would be ripping into Bob all the way down the corridor, all the way into the PM's office, past us, with a boom of the door to the Prime Minister's suite. And that's because Barron believed that Bob spoke for too long. So Barron came to me and he said, listen, mate, we can't have 5 dot points. And so I cut it to 3. Bob would come into the Parliament and he'd speak just as long. And down they'd go and slam the door. And I was able to explain to Peter Barron, it's not my fault. That's what Bob always did. He liked to develop his arguments as he was an advocate for the ACTU. Another tall tale and true is that at one point we discovered that not only was there a bowling green on the other side of the Prime Minister's suite, that if we did actually ask the security people whether they might be able to procure us some bowls. And so we developed the habit of going out and bowling a few ends. This was important for Bob because he wanted to just chill out and so on. And there was one day when one of us looked at our watch and went, oh, gee, it's 2 minutes to 2. So Bob races back in breathlessly and handles Parliament with great aplomb. But the circumstances of me coming to this place, and I think therefore being asked to convene this session was that I had been doing a PhD at the ANU under the supervision of Professor Ross Garno. And it was on resource rent taxation. It was on the very topic that we're discussing today. So 3 years of that probably qualified me for being able to speak today. It did qualify me for the PhD, so that was good. And Peter Walsh, as the Resources and Energy Minister, expressed some interest in me joining his staff to implement my PhD. Pretty good proposition, the resource rent tax. Sir John Crawford called me to his office having heard of this, and he said, "Be very careful going down there, Craig, because they drink a lot." And so I thought, well, I will be careful. Peter invited me to his office, which is diagonally that way, and on the next floor. I came in, he said, "That's your office." I thought, this is going well. And he said, "So we're going to go to the private dining room where we drank 2 bottles of Horton's White Burgundy." So Sir John Crawford's advice was promptly and totally ignored. When however, the petroleum resource rent tax, as it came to be known, was coming before the government, we did feel and experience a very strong campaign from the mining industry. I guess there's no surprise with any of that, but one of the most amazing conversations was when Paul, he said, "You can have your resource rent tax on the new Greenfields area, but you can kiss it goodbye on Fortescue." Now, 99.9% of you would say, "What's Fortescue?" Well, it was an oil field that had just been discovered in Bass Strait, where they already had the crude oil levy. And he said, "So we're just going to keep the crude oil levy, but we're going to have a higher levy on the Fortescue field because it's very prospective, it's going to be prolific." And we'd been meeting with the CEOs, who probably should remain nameless, of both BHP and Esso. The first meeting was with the CEO of BHP, and we had in mind a 30% rate on this particular field. And we talked him into it. He said, "Oh, all right, okay, well, yeah, I wouldn't be too unhappy if it was 30%. And then the next meeting, immediately after, was with the CEO of Esso. And the CEO of Esso said 25% is the maximum that we could possibly tolerate. And we said, "Well, hold on, you're Esso BHP, and your BHP colleague has just told us you could wear 30. He said, "It's all right, I'll be able to talk him down." Couldn't believe it. You got the Treasurer and the Prime Minister just rolling around in laughter. Anyway, we got the 30%. So just a potted history then until now. We did have to compromise quite a lot on my petroleum resource rent tax in order to feel, for the ministers, Prime Minister and the Treasurer, to feel comfortable with it. It was an enormous campaign against it, and it's reminiscent really, or a forerunner to the mining tax of 2010. You might remember the Henry Review, and again, this was a proposal to introduce a resource rent tax on hard minerals, and that campaign was waged against Kevin Rudd as Prime Minister not long after Julia Gillard became the Prime Minister, not particularly for that reason. Since then, there's been a review of the PRRT to try to, make it a little bit more, a little bit fairer to the community who own the minerals, and that was to hopefully get some more revenue. That didn't really work. There was a 2018 review of the PRRT, and the result of that was to bring forward some revenue. So if we go to where we are now and then go back to the Petroleum and Minerals Authority that was the subject of a double dissolution. I think we can reflect on the mining industry, its capacity to influence government decisions, always seemed to be able to get the support of the coalition for whatever they were doing. I don't want to be overly political, but that I think is a fair comment. And also, if our contributors can talk about particularly Khemlani, because when I was a boy or a young man at Sydney University, that was the big story, Rex Connor and Khemlani, because the government of the day, the Whitlam government, did effectively wanted, if not to nationalise the minerals industry, to have very much a greater involvement of government and a greater share of the revenue. So with that introduction, I'd like to welcome Associate Professor David Lee, Dr. Ben Huff, Dr. Jeremy Walker and Dr. Ruth Morgan. If you could give them a warm welcome, that would be great. And I'll try to find a chair. I think I can see it. There we go.
Thank you very much, Craig. I'll start off just about 10 years or so before the period Dr. Emerson was talking about. In 1973, Gough Whitlam and Rex Connor set up a Department of Minerals and Energy to oversee Australia's booming but increasingly foreign-owned resources sector. Connor and his officials set about drafting the Petroleum and Minerals Authority Bill. This sought first to buy back the farm by increasing Australian equity in resource projects. The bill also set up a Petroleum and Minerals Authority, one of the purposes of which was to extract the natural gas resources of the Northwest Shelf that would be transmitted by a national pipeline. Another counterfactual question is whether the PMA Act, defeated on a technicality after the joint sitting, could have allowed the Australian state to extract the same kind of dividends from its petroleum and gas resources as Norway has.
Cool. Thank you, David. Thanks, everyone. So we've been asked to give a very brief introduction, so we get straight to questions and discussion. The thing I wanted to bring, the contribution I want to bring to our discussion is to think about, the international or the internationalist context of the PMA. We tend to think about the PMA, as the archetypal version or attempt at resource nationalism or economic nationalism, Connorism as it was called at the time. But economic nationalisms normally go, or usually, or always go hand in hand with some sense of international order. At one level, the PMA was very much responding to the perceived negative impacts or consequences of foreign investment, particularly foreign investment in resources, which the Fitzgerald Review, which we heard Keating talk about, shot a light on, or politicised, we should say. So at one level it was dealing with foreign investment, but at a deeper level, I think the PMA was also a highly novel solution or response to an old policy problem that Australia had been facing, had been made explicit since the end of the Second World War, and that was what kind of place Australia should have, or what place the Australian economy should have in the world economy as an export-dependent nation. That question had been raised as an agricultural question in the 1940s. By the 1960s, it was a minerals question, and the PMA, in a way, was a very novel question as to how Australia should orientate itself in relation to those questions. That solution, I guess, my contention is that solution was very much informed by a third world internationalism that was emerging through the 60s as well at the time. It very much drew on the ideas of Global South leaders, at least in its rhetoric. The idea being that the international system could be used, and international cooperation could be used to give individual states greater power, resource-rich states greater power over their own resources. So I think there's two consequences, I think, or legacies that we can take from thinking about the PMA in an international context. One, I think it helps explain some of the visceral opposition that was ignited in response to the PMA. And the second, I think, is a contemporary legacy as well, to keep thinking through the politics of resources rather than the economics of resource. And that's something that's extremely apparent, I guess, as we emerge or go into a renewable energy transition, especially dealing with critical minerals that Australia's going to be at the centre of. So the PMA, I think, discussing the PMA, I think, brings those questions back to light.
Mm-hmm. These developments, as we see environmental concerns in this period really shifting more into the federal space in contrast to where it had been in the past. We have the Whitlam government taking France to the International Court of Justice with its concerns about French nuclear testing, using relatively recently developed principles arising from the UN Environment Conference at Stockholm in 1972. We also have efforts to save the reef via the Sea and Submerged Lands Act in 1973. So really extending Australia's sovereignty to include the Great Barrier Reef, which, while not expressly an environmental agenda, did have a great impact on preserving the reef from all kinds of extractive agendas. And then, of course, I suppose, not necessarily affected by the events that we're honouring today, but the Environmental Protection Impact of Proposals Act and Australian Heritage Commission. And I suppose if we're thinking about the kinds of pressures that the minerals industry is getting a little bit head up about when we're talking about the Petroleum and Minerals Authority, it's this rising environmentalism that is really capturing the imagination of Australians, both in cities as well as, of course, protecting more classic wilderness, so-called wilderness areas like Lake Pedder and the Great Barrier Reef. And so we're seeing a shift in the direction with the Australian Conservation Foundation moving away from what had been a rather kind of stiff scientific body to a much more activist organisation. We have a government now interested in urban development and planning, thinking about amenity, thinking about what cities are like for the people that live in them, and of course the rise of the green bands and the idea of the national estate that Ben's explored so thoroughly for the Whitlam Institute over the past couple of years. And then finally, some international context, building a little bit on what Frank mentioned earlier about the wider context that this government's working in, as well as Ben's point. And I suppose thinking about the Great Barrier Reef situation during this period, there'd been a series of oil spills that really brought home to everyday Australians that this was a environment potentially in grave danger that warranted protection. And so thinking about sovereignty was a way to, I suppose, encourage popular support to protect the reef, including from including the role of unions in protecting that reef. So while I think it would be a mistake to always read some of these initiatives strictly in environmental sense, I think it's part of these wider social changes that are threatening the interests of the mining industry, and we see that enormous pushback, which we keep seeing. Over to you, Jeremy.
Thank you. Look, thanks to all those comments. And I think that for me, so my project at the Whitlam Institute is to really look at the history of Connor and PMA. And one of the things that really strikes me about it is that it is really the high watermark of the attempt of Australian Parliament to actually act in the national interest in respect of the estate, part of which is mineral assets, and part of which is hydrocarbon reserves, which we call fossil fuels, but are in fact the air conditioning system of the earth. And so it seems to me that the enormous opposition that was catalysed by Connor, and that opposition was not confined to the Australian segment of the ownership and the direction of mineral and petroleum companies. Connor estimated that the mining industry was 62% foreign-owned. I think in the speeches that Paul Keating made in a joint sitting, he made an estimate around 84%. I think the Australian Institute estimates the petroleum industry at 91% foreign-owned. And it's interesting to me that, like Jim Cairns talks about the normalisation of taxless plunder, and with all due respect, I don't believe the petroleum resource tax has raised any revenue except from some very specific projects. But the Northwest Shelf for example, which was the rights to which the entire area was given to Woodside Petroleum for, I think, £100 by the WA government in 1964, was then the first thing across Connor's desk as the new Minister for Minerals and Energy. And I guess what my research is interested in is how that what I would call, using the terms of the people who are involved directly, the neoliberal or the free market counter-revolution against the post-war social democracy, but also very significantly about the rapid gains made by the environmental movement with strict science-based pollution control, which catalysed this whole movement of vast quantities of dark money, arguably, into these free market think tanks, which then created an atmosphere in which those goals of public ownership of the fossil fuel industry, generalised welfare, universal access to healthcare, university. So the whole Whitlam program would have been underpinned by the revenues that would have been gained had we actually owned some proportion of those resources, which we've never actually managed to raise any tax from.
All right, so just a couple of historical facts that are actually true today. I think one of the difficulties with all of this is that in the United States, the landholders own what's underneath. And in Australia, the people own what's underneath, and it happens to be true for, I think, the Middle East and also for Indonesia, Malaysia, countries like that. So we have production sharing arrangements in those places. It's a different philosophy. And SO were very frightened about the resource rent tax. They thought that what if it catches on, you know? So I just wanted to point out that kind of ownership structure breeds a particular attitude. In the other countries that I've talked about, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Middle East, it's just understood that the state would own the resource, and it was basically hiring the companies to extract the resource. They'd get a return, but then the rest would come via revenue to the people. Here in Australia, therefore, leases, I think you were saying that leases, people have, I might be wrong, but companies can just go and get a lease. No, it's issued by a state government because the states control it. I'm not saying they make good decisions all the time, and in fact, they are entitled to withdraw those leases if companies are just sitting on them, and that often is a strategy. Just sit on the leases, and then it is open to the state, or if it's in Commonwealth waters, to say the lease is terminated or it's not going to be renewed. But I thought we would go to a broader discussion, philosophical, and about Rex Conner and about what he was trying to do. Is it well before his time, or was it a perfectly reasonable thing to do? Where are we now in terms of resource extraction and the division, if you like, of the revenue that comes from it?
Thank you. How widely is that history known, that you were sort of going through about these connections and the campaigns they run, and how effective do you think it might be in these debates if that kind of history was more widely known?
Thanks for the question. Look, basically, what really struck me is that we have this, it's not known very well at all, and I think there's very few people who have studied it. Many people have written about the history of the ideas of neoliberal scholars, and by that I mean members of an organisation which you have probably heard of, but it was called the Montpellier Society, founded by Friedrich von Hayek and Milton Friedman, Ludwig von Mises, and it was really catalysed by Hayek's reaction to the British Labour Party's victory in 1945, where they brought in universal health insurance, but they also nationalised coal, steel, petroleum, gas, all of the energy basis of the economy. And we also often forget that it was really through the capacity, Tim Mitchell's written very well on this in Carbon Democracy, it was through unions, unionised activity in the coal-based economy, not so much here in Australia, but certainly in Europe, that they were able to strike in the coal mines, railways and docks and shut down the economy and win concessions, including universal suffrage. And so that history is not well known, but it was, and I find it incredible. So we look in the Voice debate again. You could see Anthony Mundine wrote, it's still up there on the Centre for Independent Studies website, where he says why there shouldn't be a voice to Parliament, because traditional owners would raise objections to the opening of new coal and gas projects.
That reference of Paul Keating to the Fitzgerald report, it was a report that attempted to divide up the proceeds from resource development between the companies and the state, and it showed a very large proportion of it going to the companies. And that obviously was a trigger to the whole Act, to Rex Connor's legislation and so on. And it actually, Paul, as Shadow Resources Minister, which he was after the 75 election, he put into the platform the resource rent tax. So he was looking for something to get more revenue for the state.
Nicholas Brown, ANU. Thank you. I wanted to try and offer a complementary, I think, view to Jeremy's, but also begin with David and on Norway and perhaps move through all of your papers. I suppose, from my perspective, one of the really interesting themes that's increasingly being emphasised about the Whitlam government is, if I can use the word market with a small m, its actual belief in market systems so long as they're appropriately geared towards enabling equitable access to distributive networks. So if we think about the tariff cut, for example, there are so many measures in which the government, John Doyle has written about this recently in terms of telecommunications, trying to get some discipline of the market back in. Isn't this, to some extent, what Rex Connor was trying to do? I mean, the rhetoric about buying back the farm, as so many of you have pointed out, is often turned into a kind of a crude, state-dominated instrumentalism. Isn't partly third world countries also trying to say, can we not please bust open this closed market that first world countries are imposing on us? Isn't this part of another part of the story, this 1974 moment, your high water mark, I think, Jeremy, where the Whitlam government is attempting through these measures, even through those electoral reforms, to say, let's find a way of getting a system that enables people to better access, as individuals, the benefits of the society?
I won't go long on this, but the model, which should be a philosophically neutral model, is the state owns the resources and it hires a contractor to develop the resources, because the state isn't necessarily going to be the very best at developing petroleum resources, hard minerals and so on. And that's why you get the production sharing model. And so no one who's thinking about production sharing thinks it's really the private sector doing it all. It's being hired to do it. The question is, what are the terms of the contract? Are they fair or are they unfair? And that is true of the resource rent tax too. It's the same idea that the state owns the resources, and by the state obviously I mean if it's offshore it's the Commonwealth and otherwise it's the states, and then they enter into an arrangement for the private sector to develop those resources, where the private sector gets a minimum return, the rest goes to the state.
But isn't one of the problems foreign ownership? So, for example, when the Northwest Shelf was developed, BHP was part of it, then an Australian company. But over time, these companies then become global multinationals, and therefore the Australian equity in the projects diluted over time.
Yeah, well, that's true, but the idea, I'm talking about the idea, not the actual formula. The idea again is that the state, for which I mean the government, should get a good share of that return, whether it's a foreign or an Australian company. And the question is, how good is the state at negotiating when the developer says, oh, if we don't get $1 gazillion, we can't develop it. And so that's usually what goes on in these sorts of negotiations.
But if you have an Australian-owned company there, you've got more bargaining power.
Yeah, that's true. And particularly, and I might say, if you've got a company from a country where the ownership of the resources resides with the people who own the land on top of it. And that is a very different philosophy in the US. And I think it's why American companies get really, really exercised about models where the government of another country says, no, we own the resources, we're hiring you. They don't like that very much.
Not knowing is that it seems to me that Rex O'Connor had a vision of some sort, but that history through the Loans Affair discredited him. But it seems to me that the idea of having authority to broker the sort of semi-democratic processes over our resources industries was a new idea of its time. My question is, was there any residual commitment to his ideas in the Hawke-Keating era? And if not, why not?
No, the Hawke and Keating governments didn't try to set up a Petroleum and Minerals Authority.
Well, the question is not so much of the authority, but...
Yeah, but I know, but something like that, a body like that, that runs the minerals and energy sector and all that. I suppose you would call it, I'm just giving you the best answer I can, the Department of Resources and Energy. It does, that's what it does. So it's not as, the first word I think is alluring, it's not as, I won't use the word erotic, it's evocative. Evocative was probably the word I was thinking of. But the philosophy, it was a different philosophy for the times, but I wouldn't say it was different to the philosophy in a lot of other countries. And that's why I talk about production sharing in Indonesia, Malaysia and the Middle East. Their philosophy was that they owned and they hired where they needed to do that work.
Right, and I'll jump in here so I get a quick moment. If you look at the second reading speeches, both from 73 when the bill was first introduced and again in the joint hearing, I think Connor tries to make this point that this is not a particularly novel idea. He rattles off, I think, 15 different other countries that have some kind of state sharing arrangement. So part of the rhetoric of trying to sell this idea is Australia is something of an outlier in the fact that we don't take more control of the enormous resources that we have. To your question from before, Nick, in terms of thinking about small air markets, I think that's precisely what is being attempted here. Let's try and rewrite the rules of what a resource market, international market, looks like. So we've talked a lot about the leases and who owns the resources underground, but a lot of this was really about controlling, well, who benefits when the minerals get into the ships and go overseas. So, and the PMA, I think we have to remember, is only one component of a much broader vision, and that's, I think, right to your question. It was a vision. Export controls were introduced very early on. Tax incentives and subsidies were abolished. Help me out, David, here. What were the other components?
Another thing that happens after Connor's demise is John Menadue, who was Secretary of the Prime Minister's Department, was interested in investigating a proposal from Consing Rio Tinto, which was then minority Australian-owned. It was controlled by its British head company. They had a plan to buy back, to buy out and make that company an Australian company with Australian government support. So that was something that he was certainly pushing, that fitted in with that kind of resource nationalist philosophy. It didn't go anywhere because of the dismissal, but that's one other.
But I think you talk in your book as well to this question about legacies. You talk about Fraser continuing the Australianisation of the... and I think your line is Australianisation by other means. It's not this kind of direct approach of setting up an authority, but how do we incentivise Australian companies to buy out a greater share of those companies?
And how do we incentivise Australian or foreign companies to get the best possible price?
And I think to answer the question, Paul, as we know, is always eloquent and powerful. He was arguing for this authority. He wasn't it didn't look to me like he was just wild-eyed and didn't know what he was talking about or anything like that. He actually believed that could...
He did then, but I think Paul was one of the most interesting characters to discuss in this story because, of course, he's the Prime Minister who totally liberalises the mining industry in the early 90s with the One Nation economic statement. So there is we can look at the young Paul Keating who gives this wonderful speech in 74 and defends the PMA in those very similar terms to Connor does. But I think there is a story there to be told about Keating's... there's multiple ways in which this could be told. I don't think it has to be purely an ideological one, but his transformation from the young Keating who does defend the PMA to the Prime Minister who completely liberates Australia's mining sector to
and it might have been with the pipeline, which was not that radical actually, is to get gas from Western Australia to Eastern Australia. What are people now wanting? To get gas from Western Australia to Eastern Australia. Andrew Forrest wants to do it by ship, right? So it's not completely crazy, but I think he did not find the most reputable person to be involved in Khemlani. And that I do remember that went on and on and on and on. So it wasn't a 2-week event. And I think that everything was just sinking then.
Hi, Graham again. Look, I don't know that much about economics, but in Mr. Keating's speech on 7th of August, he talks a lot, almost a nationalistic way, about how Aussies are the greatest savers in the world and so on. He refers to Commonwealth pension funds. And I was thinking, if you're going to buy back the farm or have much more local capital, is there a missing ingredient here that then comes in with superannuation, which means we finally get massive capital markets here? But by that time, the Keating economic philosophy is much more liberal, smaller liberal than what I was speaking in 1974.
I think super was 1992, John, around then.
Yes, but that, potentially could have been diverted or used in ways that I'm sure Rex Connor would have had a different view about how you would tell super.
I don't know where we go. Put Rex in charge of superannuation.
I suppose my question probably touches back on 1974, which is, I suppose the Petroleum and Minerals Authority encourages us to think about questions of ownership, assets, capital. I wondered about workers in the minerals and energy sector and how we kind of should imagine or understand their place in the story of what could have been the PMA. On the one hand, it would have transformed the skill base of workers in that sector, I imagine, in terms of greater local processing and development of minerals rather than simply exporting. But at the same time, workers are very active, as you said, Ruth, in the green van movements. The joint sitting is replete with references to Jack Monday, as Reg Withers calls him. So I suppose I wanted to ask a broad question about how we should understand the place of Australian workers in the story of the PMA.
Well, if the PMA had got up and then been proved legal, it would have been an employer, it would have, as you said, brought in people with necessary skills in the petroleum industry, it would have been an explorer as well. That's why the mining companies didn't like that, because they thought it unfairly competed with them. In addition to that, it sat in a kind of environment where Connor's idea was the Commonwealth would take over exploration and mining of uranium in the Northern Territory through the Australian Atomic Energy Commission. So those minerals which the Commonwealth could control, like Northern Territory uranium and other offshore gas, the Commonwealth would have a greater role than it had previously.
Okay, I think we better wind up this session for just checking the program, but I think we've had a good go, and we have Whitlam and the health system reform to come. Thank you very much.